Val has a question for us.
Hey, you guys, I'm Val from Germany, and I'm a Patreon subscriber. As I recently moved out to study psychology abroad, I've been living out of a suitcase. And while I was first unhappy with that situation, I've since learned that it's actually helping me a lot because I'm not very worried or bothered by any clutter physically, and I'm really, really enjoying that. So you talk about a lot of methods and principles about physical minimalism and letting go the stuff and all the possessions. And you also then applies those principles on emotional minimalism, which is simplifying relationships, commitments, and letting go of that emotional baggage. So I'm wondering if you have a perspective on existential minimalism, which would be simplifying identity or how you deal with ego attachments, and if you have any concepts of self. Now, I'm rather philosophical by nature, and the principles that I personally live by are concepts prevalent in other belief systems. For example, Taoism, Advaita Vedanta, which both practice this principle of non-attachment, which to me inherently is also kind of minimalist, isn't it? Because it's fundamentally about letting go of all the noise, all the surroundings, which in minimalism is practiced in a very physical or emotional way. But what if we also take this in an existentialist approach? So Advaita Vedanta also takes a different route and has this principle of Maya, of the world being an illusion, which to me personally more translates into the real meaning of life, not being in the illusion of the physical world, which I also see as a rather minimalistic, or maybe something that somewhat is a parallel to what minimalism also teaches, in that the material world by itself is not the most meaningful, as you then try to reduce that and only what you need, So I'm really wondering what your approach is generally, what the term existential minimalism even means to you, and what concepts you would see as a part of it.
Yeah, I think if there was a Venn diagram with stoicism and minimalism and non-dual thinking and different philosophies that are in that vein, I think there's a ton of overlap. When we talk about minimalism, it often starts with the stuff and in terms of lifestyle minimalism. Although if you talk about other kinds of minimalism, it's like minimalist literature, whether it's Laurie Moore or Bret Easton Ellis back in the 1980s, or you look at like Donald Judd and minimalist art from a bygone era, or you look at minimalist architecture, whether that's Mies van der Rohe or someone like that. But minimalism as a lifestyle, it tends to start with the stuff because it recognizes a relatively new problem. It's the accumulation of more things than we will ever need. And for the longest time, that wasn't much of an issue. Back when Epictetus was alive, there was no hoarder's equivalent back then. Although, maybe relatively speaking, there probably was, because they had the wisdom to recognize that even then, certain things could get in the way.
Although, it's funny, it wasn't a widespread problem, but it was a problem for a select few.
Right.
So one of the only jokes in Meditations is very serious philosophical work. Marcus Aurelius has a joke, which isn't his, it appears elsewhere, but he jokes about a rich man who has so much stuff he has no place to shit. And he's basically describing not just, I think, hoarding, but the way that wealthy people especially just accumulate they see it and they want it, they get it.
Yes.
And to a point where you drowned under the weight of your own stuff. So what is fascinating about the Romans, and perhaps this is why the Stoics are relevant again today, is that a philosophy that was, primarily, although there were Stoics on the other end of the spectrum, Epictetus being one of them, but the philosophy of the Roman emperor, who's dealing with abundance and stress and responsibility, all of his problems are problems of abundance. Mm-hmm. 2,000 years later, the rest of society has caught up to where the average person's life is probably better than Marcus Aurelius' life. Mm-hmm. We don't command the Roman army, but we can do the things that only the emperor could do 2,000 years ago. And so when you read a work like Meditations and you hear him reminding himself like, hey, you can't take this with you when you die. Hey, don't be like one of these people that accumulate so much stuff you don't even have freedom of movement anymore, etc. it hits close to home because through the miracles of technology and capitalism, and I use sort of miracle there and somewhat ironically, we can relate to feelings that previously would have been unfathomable.
Yeah. And everyone now has access to not just an abundance, I love that word, but a super abundance.
Yes.
A superfluous amount of things that is ever growing still. You have access to functionally infinite things, and yet you can still get more. And yet functionally infinite is no longer enough. I do want to talk a bit, because you mentioned identity and ego. I know we've touched on those things already, but before we do that, let's get practical for a moment, TK, because we see this all the time at our live events. So people will come up to us and they'll say, the happiest time in my life was when everything I own fit in a suitcase. Yeah. And that's what she's talking about here. Like, I lived out of a suitcase for a while, and maybe that's good for your mental health.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about self-discovery is that it's through our exploration of contrast and constraint that we come to know the possibilities of our own being. So you think about the nature of technology. These are essentially tools that extend our reach, right? What does my cell phone allow me to do? What does an automobile allow me to do? What does the internet allow me to do? It allows me to do what I was already doing, connecting with people, but in a way that extends my reach. Well, you take those things away, where am I? I'm grounded in my own being again, and I have to explore the possibilities of how far I can reach without those things that I previously depended on. And so one of the consequences of so much abundance is that we're able to extend our reach because of all of these amenities and technologies that we have. When we simplify our lives, even as a spiritual discipline or an experimental practice, we say, I'm going to go without this or that. We get in touch with the possibilities of our own being once again, and we say, wow, I'm actually more capable than I realized I was. I've been using a calculator for so long. I've been using my GPS to get home for so long that I lost respect for my sense of direction. You ever have that happen where it's like you don't have your phone on you and you're going somewhere that you've traveled all the time and you go, uh-oh, I don't even know how to get home. I don't even know how to get to work. And I should know this because I've taken this path so many times, but I'm so spoiled by this amenity that I have. And when you don't have that, you've got to call upon those improvisational skills. You got to call upon the ability to discern where you are, and you get it figured out. And there's a good feeling on the other side of figuring out that makes you say, oh yeah, I have something so special inside of me. It's called a sense of direction. And simplicity does that for us. So living out of a suitcase really puts you in touch with your personal power in a way that can only happen when there's an absence of amenities.
That phrase existential minimalism is interesting. I think what we're really coming to is what matters, what actually matters. That's the through line for all of them. What stuff actually matters, what work actually matters, what things should you care about and what things should you not care about. And the Stoics have this idea of indifference, and that's a controversial word, right? We tend to think of indifference as being a negative thing, like we don't care. But knowing what to care about and what not to care about, that is the philosophical question. And for them, it mostly came down to, sort of what stuff's in your control and what stuff isn't. But I mean, even as you go through your life, you have goals. How many of our goals are based on things that are not up to us? So we tell ourselves, I'm working really hard to do this. But actually, work isn't going to determine whether you get that thing or not. Work might get you in contention for a Nobel Prize or a National Book Award or a fellowship here or there. But ultimately, some committee decides, right? Some group of people decide. And it's not a meritocracy. It's not fair, right? There's no, if you do X, you are contractually obligated to get Y. And so a lot of people's identity, and indeed their whole lives, is directed at achieving things that philosophically luck is going to determine, right? Randomness is going to determine. Some other person who likes you or doesn't like you is going to decide. And so, deciding what matters and what you're going to orient yourself towards is really what it's about. And I think what Stoicism has helped me with is really getting clear about what I am striving for and whether that thing is up to me or not. If it is up to me, then it can be worth putting up. Am I trying to be the author who sells the most, or am I trying to be the best author that I am capable of being? And those are two different identity or even existential questions, right? And if I choose to be the best selling or the most recognized or the most famous or whatever, I better hope I get some breaks.
Right.
If it is to be the best that I'm capable of being, well, then that's a thing that I get to determine every day, and it's much more reasonable that I'll achieve it or not.
And the difficulty behind that is it's not as measurable.
Yes, right.
You can say, I've reached the goal, I've sold X number of books, or I hit this bestseller list and for this many weeks, and that was the goal. And then strangely, we say, what? I'll give myself permission to be happy then?
Yeah.
Like, we'll forego happiness until I reach that thing. I was thinking, she was talking about Maya earlier, and Val mentioned Maya. And Jed McKenna calls Maya the goddess of delusion. And I think sometimes when we're talking about identity or ego, which is fundamentally the same thing, every identity is a fiction. Every identity is a false identity in some sense, right? They're great as labels. You're a writer. But not right now. You're not writing anything. You were a few seconds ago, but now you're not a writer, right? And so like in this moment, what does that mean? It's a useful label. It helps me describe Ryan Holiday or T.K. Coleman. But if that becomes my identity, this is who I am as a person. This is where I derive my self-worth. This is myself. Well, what happens when that goes away?
What if it gets taken away?
Tell me about that.
Well, I'm just saying, like, if your identity is like, I'm an NBA All-Star, what happens if you don't make the NBA All-Star team? Or what if you blow out your knee and your career comes to a sudden and unexpected end? Now, who are you? Yeah. Right? If your identity was like, I love the game of basketball and I want to be involved in the game of basketball, that's a much more robust and resilient identity that is, by the way, not so self-centered or narcissistic, right? Because it can be about helping other people play. It can be writing about it. It can be commentating on it. It can be coaching. It can be a number of things. But if you're like, no, this is what I am, you better hope reality cooperates, which it doesn't always do. In fact, it often doesn't. So, the distinction between, to go to your point about writing, the distinction between writing and publishing is a big one, right? Writing is more or less my control. Yeah, sure, I'm not writing exactly the second, but I could be thinking about it. You can't really stop me from doing that. But I could get blacklisted, I could get thrown in prison. You could take away my ability to publish. So like one of the things I've taken to thinking is like, I'm very ambitious as a writer. I'm not very ambitious as an author. Not anymore, right? Like being ambitious as an author is like, where do I rank against other authors? Or how are things selling? Or what is my, retail footprint? Or, all these things that, look, I'm not saying they're uncorrelated with effort and activity, but they are not solely up to you, right? Sometimes you're of the moment, sometimes you're not. You know as well as I do, things happen and all of a sudden you're in the zeitgeist and then all of a sudden the zeitgeist changes. So my ambition is like, am I getting better at the thing? Per my standards, per my judgment, and maybe a handful of people that I'm close to, but that my ambition isn't to do what the Stoics would call externals so much anymore, but is instead about the internals, which I have a say about.
And isn't that what Val did here? When she talked about the suitcases, she limited the externals, right?
Yeah.
I think about Rupert Spira. He talks about, we often think of lucid dreaming. He says enlightenment is lucid wakening. And like realizing that it is all a dream on some level, right? And part of that dream is like those identities that we construct in our mind. I am a writer. I am a yoga instructor. I am an astronaut. But then what happens to you when you take that away? The self tends to get pretty slippery pretty quickly.
That's right. And Advaita would say the real question to ask is, who is the you that's letting go? That the last act of letting go, if you will, is that sense of identity to which we cling. I am a this, I am a that. All of these identities, they're approximations, just as you say. And I like the NBA analogy because even the person who pulls it off, they eventually have to do exactly what you say. When Charles Barkley retires, what does he have to do? He says, well, I'm going to talk about it. Or you see these guys say, I'm going to start a camp and teach the kids how to play the game. Or I'm going to make documentaries and talk about the aesthetic dimension of the game. And so even when we do get what we want, life always challenges us to go beyond that. And if you really look at it, whatever it is that we call personal evolution or personal improvement or personal growth, it's when we take our identity to be one thing, and then we get to a point where we expand those boundaries a little bit more and say, I am that which I once perceived myself not to be, and I am not that which I once perceived myself to be. And we call that growth. And we continue to grow throughout our lives until we choose not to. And that's really negotiating that limited conception of identity we had.
Well, it's ephemeral for everyone, right? Even the person who has the longest run eventually dies. So if we know that it comes to an end, but I think the decision to make it it's like the distinction between, am I a politician, like am I a senator, congressman, president, or am I a public servant? One is much more flexible and allows you to serve and be of use in a variety of capacities. And the other has to cling to what you currently possess. And, I think the reason that we hear from the ancients, whether it's the Buddhists and the Confucians or the Stoics and the Epicureans, about this ephemerality is that things were so much more ephemeral back then. You could be thrown in prison by a king. You could get a cut on your finger and die. There could be a plague. There could be all these things. And in fact, there were all these things. Society was so much less stable and things were so much more in flux, and leaders were more capricious, and the rule of law was so much, less robust. And, in many ways, this should, when you enter a period of instability and chaos like we're in now, some of these things come rushing back a little bit. But you go, oh, they knew at a more firsthand level why you can't take this stuff for granted. And the certainty and stability that you are sensing is an illusion. It can go away at any moment. Yeah. And so we can learn from these people and go, okay, how do I have the idea? How do I still engage in the world and try to make a difference and try to do things and try to realize my potential? But how do I make sure I'm zeroing in on the right target as opposed to, a target that can, I can't ever actually possess.
Yeah. If you pan out far enough, it's all uncertain.
Sure.
Yeah. And so like that story of certainty. I remember when I left the corporate world in 2011, everyone's like, but what about job security? And then that very corporation was sold to another corporation and like closed all the stores that I was in charge of for all those years. And so like, well, there's the certainty. All you have to do is pan out a little bit and you realize how uncertain it all is.
Well, it's funny. I just interviewed this guy, John Amachi, who's an NBA player. And he was on the Orlando Magic, and he turned down like $20 million from a different team to leave them to stay with the Magic, who he felt loyal to for like, still NBA money, but like not anything like $20 million. And so everyone sort of like debated this, should he did it? Should he have stayed loyal? What happened? And the funny thing I sort of let drop while I was talking to him is he did all his banking with Bear Stearns. And like 3 years later, he just lost all the money anyway, which I'm not laughing at. I'm just saying the irony of you go, no, you always take more money because, you never know. And it's like, you also don't know if you take the money, whether you get to keep that either.
That's
so
right.
What is stable? Like what is the reason you make the hard choices, the reason you stick with principles, the reason you do what you have to sleep with at night is like, that is really the only thing that you get to take with you is did you feel good about the choice when you made it? You don't know if it's going to, the idea of like, I'm doing this because it's safer or better or smarter, or you don't know.
Yeah.
Just don't know.
Isn't it interesting that we have so much confidence in whatever the story of security is that we tell ourselves? So for instance, the artist comes out to Hollywood, I'm going to be an actor, and that's the hard thing. But then when they get to the point where they question that dream, they go, man, I'm just going to go to corporate America and succeed. Whoa. What makes you think you're going to do that?
Yeah.
Corporate America can eat you alive just like Hollywood. It takes a lot of hard work to succeed in corporate America. You're going to have to make some compromises and some tough decisions. What is this thing that we call security? In many ways, it reveals a kind of presumptuous attitude that we have towards these other fields and the people that work in them, or towards these other lifestyles. There is no lifestyle. There is no career path. There is no job. There is no company that offers you this guarantee of security independently of how you react and respond to the circumstances of your life. It can all go down. It can all be lost.
And even if they guarantee you security, that's a guarantee that they can't keep.
Sure.
You were illustrating that a moment ago, like everything on a long enough timeline is ephemeral. And yes, in some ways, it was more ephemeral during the Stoics, although you could even make an argument that creations today are so ephemeral. Here's another podcast episode. Here's another tweet. Here's another Instagram reel. Here's another TikTok. Here's another Sora video. Here's AI, and it's more and more. The ephemerality of it is reaching this level. You know, it makes me think of Alan Watts. He said that mountains are just waves in slow motion. And it's like, yeah, you pan out far enough, even a mountain is the same thing as a wave.
Thanks for watching this highlight. If you'd like to check out another one, you can watch this clip here. Or if you'd like to watch the full episode for this highlight clip, you can check out this one here. Or you can dive into the full private podcast by subscribing via the Patreon link in the description for this video. Your Patreon support is what helps keep this podcast 100% advertisement free.